The cattle drive of the 1870s was not a journey of self-discovery or a pursuit of freedom. It was a massive, mobile extraction of value, an industrial-scale transfer of biological capital from the grasslands of Texas to the railheads of Kansas. When you see 3,000 head of longhorns stretching across the horizon, you aren't looking at nature. You are looking at a 3 million pound protein processing plant on the move. And the men tasked with driving that mass? They weren't the romantic icons of your childhood stories. They were biological gears in a high-friction machine, disposable components that were expected to grind themselves into the dirt to keep the capital moving. A cowboy in the late 19th century was a high-attrition, high-performance biological engine. This was a human being subjected to 14 hours of constant kinetic shock in a saddle, breathing the pulverized lung tissue of thousands of animals, and existing in a state of permanent sleep deprivation. To keep this engine from seizing up, the frontier didn't offer a menu. It offered a cold, mathematical administration of protein, lipids, and neurochemical stimulants. In 1866, Charles Goodnight looked at the vast, empty expanse of the Panhandle and realized that you cannot move capital across a desert without a mobile maintenance station. He took a surplus army wagon, reinforced the steel axles, and built the chuck box. This wasn't a kitchen. It was the logistical brain of the drive. Every tool, every gram of flour, and every drop of medicine was audited for its caloric utility. The man in charge of this hub, the cookie, was the most powerful biological gatekeeper on the trail. He wasn't a chef. He was an engineer of human output. He was usually a man whose own body had been broken by the trail, and he understood that his only job was to prevent a systemic hardware failure among the crew. He didn't care about the presentation of the plate. He cared about the total energy load of the crew. He was the only man who could tell the trail boss to go to hell, because he held the keys to the only thing that mattered: the fuel supply. The first requirement for a 4 a.m. start in a world without light is the artificial override of the human circadian rhythm. On the trail, exhaustion was a liability that the market couldn't afford. To bypass the brain's biological demand for rest, the frontier utilized a chemical weapon, Arbuckle's Ariosa. This wasn't brewed for its notes or its aroma. It was an industrial extraction process. The beans were coated in a glaze of egg white and sugar to seal in the oils, preventing the loss of potency during transport. The cowboys ground these beans by hand in a mill bolted to the side of the wagon, a rhythmic mechanical labor that began before the sun. They threw the grounds into a pot of alkaline river water and boiled it until it achieved the viscosity of crude oil. They called it six-shooter coffee. The legend was that if you dropped a lewd bullet into the pot and it sank, the coffee wasn't ready. You needed it thick enough to float a horseshoe. This wasn't a beverage, it was a neurological whip. The massive dose of caffeine was the only thing keeping the prefrontal cortex firing when the body had been in the saddle for 18 hours. You drank it hot enough to blister your throat, not because you enjoyed the heat, but because the physical pain was the only thing reminding you that you were still conscious. It was a liquid override for a nervous system on the brink of collapse. On the Great Plains, there is no grocery store, and yeast does not come in a packet. To provide the necessary carbohydrate chassis for the day's labor, every chuckwagon carried a sourdough starter, a living, volatile colony of bacteria kept in a wooden keg. This was the mother. It was a fermenting mass of flour and water that captured wild yeast from the air. The cookie treated this keg with a reverence that bordered on the religious. During the lethal frosts of the High Plains nights, the cook would sleep with the keg inside his own bedroll. He wasn't being sentimental. He was keeping the bacteria alive. If the starter froze, the supply of pre-digested grain died. And if the bread died, the crew's biological battery followed shortly after. The sourdough was a biological hack. The fermentation process broke down the complex starches of the flour before it ever hit the cowboy's stomach, making the glucose available for immediate absorption into the bloodstream. They would take this fermented dough, drop it into a Dutch oven filled with boiling lard, and produce biscuits with the density of a lead sinker. It was a slow-release caloric brick. It sat in the gut for 8 hours, leaking energy into the system to prevent the hypoglycemic crashes that lead to a rider losing control of his mount during a midnight stampede. This was the fuel that powered the muscle, a constant, steady burn of grain and fat. Beef was the commodity, but it was also the fuel. However, you didn't kill a prime $5 per head steer just to feed a trailhand. That would be a catastrophic loss of profit. You ate the slippage, the animals that broke their legs in a prairie dog hole, or the calves born on the move that couldn't maintain the pace of the herd. When a calf was slaughtered, the frontier's zero-waste policy went into effect. They called the result "son of a bitch stew," and it was a visceral map of the animal's internal anatomy. They didn't just use the muscle. Muscle was the least nutrient-dense part of the animal. They harvested the heart, the liver, the kidneys, and the marrow gut. The marrow gut was the secret to the biology of the trail. It was the upper part of the small intestine of a suckling calf, still filled with the digestive enzymes. When boiled, it released a rich, creamy, iron-scented sauce. This wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a nutritional necessity. Cowboys, living on a diet of dry grain and salt-cured meat, were perpetually on the verge of systemic inflammation. The offal, the organs, provided the vitamin A, the B12, and the essential fatty acids. The stew was a thick, gray, steaming slurry of biological essentials. It tasted of iron, bile, and fat. It was the taste of the frontier's brutal efficiency. You swallowed it fast, letting the visceral fats lubricate a body that was being ground into dust by the trail. The final factor in the cowboy's biological equation was the electrolyte balance. A man sweating under a 100-degree sun in a wool shirt loses 5 to 7 liters of fluid a day. Along with that fluid, he loses the salt and potassium required to keep his heart beating in a regular rhythm. To compensate, every piece of protein was aggressively salt-cured. Salt pork, salt beef, and salt-heavy lard. Every meal was a massive infusion of sodium designed to force the body to retain water, preventing the systemic dehydration that turns a man's blood into sludge. To balance this, they carried Arbuckle's peppermints, a rare burst of pure sucrose and glucose used for a quick hit of energy during the final, exhausting hours of the day. And then, there was the seasoning that no one asked for: the dust. The trail wasn't a road. It was a 1,000-mile cloud of pulverized limestone, dried manure, and mineral grit. It was in the air, it was in the water, and it was in the stew. You felt it between your teeth with every bite. This wasn't just an annoyance. It was a constant mineral load. You were literally eating the geography you were trying to conquer. The alkaline dust settled in the lungs and the stomach, neutralizing acids and changing the very chemistry of the body. We look at the Chuckwagon through the lens of nostalgia. We see a rustic outdoor kitchen. I see a high-efficiency mobile maintenance station designed to keep a disposable labor force moving toward a market. The cookie didn't care about the cowboy's palate. He didn't care about his health. He cared about the output. If the crew's biological battery died, the cattle stopped moving. If the cattle stopped moving, the capital didn't grow. In the 1870s, the market was the only thing with a soul. The men were just the biological transport system, a collection of meat and bone used to move a more valuable collection of meat and bone across a wasteland. We've sanitized this history. We've turned it into barbecue and Western-themed restaurants. We've removed the bitterness of the boiled acid, the smell of the raw offal, and the grit of the alkaline dust. But the real frontier doesn't have a menu. It only has a ledger. And on the trail, you either provided enough energy to move the herd, or you were left in the dirt to be reclaimed by the minerals. My name is Nathaniel Blackwood, and history is never what you think.